Story 8 begins with the character Longarine, one of the more clever of the group, vowing to tell a story that demonstrates how easy men are to deceive. And she does that with one of the more colorful and amusing of the early stories. And she tells a story about how there was this man in the county of Aeolus who is married, and he takes a particular extramarital interest in his wife's chambermaid, and he's talking to his friend about this. Guys, they talk. And he says, I gotta get this. Now the chambermaid has been sort of like, pushing him off, like, no thanks, mister. But he keeps pressing, and he's talking about it to to his friend, and his friend is sort of egging him on, saying, "Yeah, go for it." The chambermaid goes and complains to the wife, always a problem, and don't poop where you eat. Chambermaid complains to the wife. The wife is getting frustrated with it, like, "Oh, man," and comes up with a rather ingenious little plan. And she tells the chambermaid, "Okay, go back to my husband, or if he says this again, if he does this again, next time he does this, he's going to, tell him, agree, set a date, and tell him to come into. We're going to set you up in my in a little in one of my rooms, my little dressing room, and just tell him that you can come in, and we'll go for it." This is the wife saying this to the chambermaid. The chambermaid goes back and does this, and the husband, "Oh wow, yeah, great, great, great," and he goes and he tells his buddy. And his buddy's like, "Oh man, that sounds great. I wish I could get some of that." He wants to, whereupon his friend insisted on taking his share, is the phrase Longarine used. Taking his share, which is a little crude, a little rude. And he wants a piece of that, let's say. So they come up with this plan, two friends, and say, "Well, okay, after I get done, I'll come out, I'll tag team you, you can go in, you can get a turn." And these two guys think, "This sounds pretty good." What are they, frat boys? But the night comes, and the wife is sitting there in the bed in the dark, and at the appointed time, the door opens. Her husband comes in, and well, things happen, and the husband is really quite taken with it, and the wife, wow, this is different. Without exchanging a word, presumably. The husband, who thought he was deceiving his wife, he stayed in bed with her for some time, not as long as he might have wished. Many years of marriage were beginning to tell on him. Yeah, older guys. Well, these things happen. But still, better, because he thought in his mind that, well, this is illicit. This is the chambermaid, and she had the knowledge that, well, I'm kind of getting one over on you. This is just get it out of your system. They're play acting, they're role playing, and this is working for them evidently. So the husband goes out, and he's just like, "Oh wow, oof, that was incredible. You gotta get in there. She was just fantastic." And so the friend goes in, and the wife does not know that this is going on. So, she just sees that, well, suddenly the door opened and closed again, and now there's something. Hey, he's back in bed. Okay, round two. And suddenly he is much better than he had been. And wow, this is quite invigorating for her, you would say. And she's having a good time, and she's like, wow, this is really different. And that ends eventually soon. And in the end, the friend, as a little souvenir, uh, slips a ring off the finger. He finds, and when they're doing whatever, he seems to notice that she is wearing a ring, so he just slips it off her finger as a little forget me not, or a little, souvenir. And he goes back out and he tells his friend, his buddy, he's like, wow, that was just incredible. You're right, oh, and I wanted to remember something, so I took this little ring. And he holds up the ring, and the husband sees it and sees it as his friend had on his finger a ring that was identical to the one he had given his wife on their wedding day. Identical. Um, it had no real difference physically, but it had a emotional and symbolic significance that was more than just the physical properties of one ring or the other. And that significance strikes him. And the metaphor is pretty obvious about the one thing looks like the other, but it has an association. It has a metaphorical value that is above and beyond its physical value. And he goes in to see the wife, and he's feeling like, oh my God, what happened? What is going on? And it comes out, and the wife sort of confronts him and says, you were so silly. I had to teach you a lesson, but boy, the first time was all right, but that second time was just fantastic. And he's sitting there thinking like, that wasn't me the second time. So he knows that he has been, the term would be cuckolded. She does not. She just thinks, well, we had sort of a silly night, and no harm, no foul. He didn't cheat. It was me. We just did a little role playing thing, I guess. And she will forgive him for it. She just sort of excuses his dalliance that he thought he was having as, the result of some depraved, pent up lust. You enjoyed it so much because you were seething with some depraved, pent up lust. Because it's all sort of silly. It's all just, physical properties. But it is the idea that carries the extra spice, that carries the meaning, that makes it more significant. The husband, according to her, the husband thought that he was cheating with the chambermaid, and so he was more into, let's say, the act than he would be normally. So it is all just a mental property. It is the context, thus, that matters. And he is sitting there realizing like the depth of how much he screwed up and what he has done to himself and his own dignity. And this is horrifying to him. He had gone and given himself cuckold's horns and made himself look ridiculous forevermore. But he could see she was already angry enough about the chambermaid, and he did not dare tell her about the other dirty trick he had played. So he just let her live in ignorance of this. And she just went on like, oh, okay, everything's fine. She came out clearly ahead. He didn't have the suggestion there because he's dwelling on the idea of cuckoldry. He didn't want to admit that he had been cuckolded. So he didn't go into the rest of this. And presumably he didn't ever tell his friend about that either. You can see that there is some shame brought in on this, and perhaps he has learned a lesson. Guys, who knows? So he promised that he would leave his wicked ways behind him. Is this sincere? I don't know. The husband was branded a cuckold without his wife having done a single thing to disgrace herself. The context works both ways. She didn't know she was cheating, so it wasn't necessarily cheating. The physicality is just sort of a silly part of it that doesn't ultimately mean anything. In her heart, she was being faithful. And that's what really matters. And that's how she can go on and she has a happy life. And he, because he knows this truth, is sort of humiliated. And of course, after the story, you get the reactions. And it's a cute little story of sexuality and cuckoldry and, mistaken identity. It's almost like a sitcom plot. The kind that you find an awful lot in Boccaccio, but here from a different point of view, very much from the woman's point of view. And with Boccaccio, the sexuality was always kind of the point. And it was always, they're getting physical, and the lust was a central driving factor in it. Here it is almost tangential. It is all about the emotional value of it, all about the truth of it, all about the rational part of it. They seem to be, the women in the Heptameron are telling these stories that give a sense of perspective to sexuality. And they're saying, they're always putting it in a context of being, well, it's just the irrational part of it. And what really matters is the emotional connection between it, or the emotional disconnection between it. And this doesn't get enough attention in art and culture and gender dynamics in general. So they go on to discuss this afterwards. And, this story gets it hits close to home for a lot of these aristocratic men in the room, in the group, who are a little offended that this story would be like that. And in fact, Longarine ends her story, ladies, it strikes me that if all the men who offend their wives like that got a punishment like that, then Hircan and Saffredent ought to be feeling a bit nervous. So she calls out specifically the two most egregious playboys of the group. And Saffredent rejects this, says, oh, come on now, Longarine. Hircan and I aren't the only married men here, And they have this little back and forth where they debate whether or not it is what the value of the story is. And you could see that it's a little uncomfortable because they're talking about the fairness of gender and sexuality, and how in their culture, perhaps, boys will be boys, and you can't expect them to, just stay settled down with one woman. And the story itself began with that phrase where the husband believed very much in marital fidelity for the woman, not so much for the men. And of course, at the end, that was totally overturned on him. So it is this power dynamic that is really at the core of the story, and that is irritating the difference between how the men receive the story and how the women receive the story. And they're all interpreting it in slightly different ways. And it takes Dagosan, the more philosophical, Platonic of the group, to come in and lay down a preposition that perhaps summarizes the perspective of the story. And he says, when a man already has everything he needs in order to be contented, Dagosan is sort of laying out the philosophical truth of it, boiling it down. Everything he has to be contented, it is very unreasonable of him to go off and seek satisfaction elsewhere. It has often struck me that when people are not satisfied with what they already have and think that they can find something better, then they only make themselves worse off. And they do not get any sympathy because inconstancy is one thing that is universally condemned. And here he's putting it in very universal terms, very idealized terms. He's no longer putting it in just terms of like that one story or even of a man woman marriage construct, but he's just casting it in terms of when you want more than you can have and when you act irrationally to pursue something that is probably not worth the risk. And here you get that 40,000 foot perspective on the problem, and you're encouraged to think about it in broader terms. Now, significantly, you have to think about who is talking about this. These are a bunch of aristocrats. This is potentially, Marguerite de Navarre and the French royal family and everything that had been going on in France, which we're not going into. But stability, social stability, is important to them, and marital instability translates into social instability. Marital instability in a aristocratic royal conception means that you have problems with lineage, problems with the transfer of power, problems with who inherits what, where does the money come from, where does the money go to, whose son can take over when the big king dies. All of these problems arise, and it's no longer marriage dynamics at that point. It has real world consequences in terms of massive geopolitics. And you can see the folly in that, where just because one man gets a little bit of a tickle, he decides to act irrationally, and that has consequences down the line that will destabilize the entire world. It's not something, just a harmless little game between two frat boy friends who think they can get away with something. It has consequences, and maybe they don't understand them, but chances are they're going to end up losing. Now, significantly, these two men are not aristocrats. Longarine is telling this story as if, they're less than we are. It's a little different, but she's not really emphasizing that. It slips in. She doesn't say really anything about the primary husband and wife, but she slips in that the friend was a tailor, just a tradesman, a commoner, and says that, and the husband is they're roughly the same socioeconomic class. They're very similar. So we're dealing with a merchant class, presumably one that's on the rise, the rising middle class in the early Renaissance, and one that is perhaps jostling against some of these strictures of rule. You can make this suggestion that, well, maybe this argument is also intended for an economic interpretation, where somebody who wants something more can destabilize things and cause problems. And why can't they all just be happy with what they have? Well, if you're looking at it from an economic point of view, what they have is, middle class, or, presumably low level subsistence with a little bit of capital infused, but they shouldn't press too hard for the kind of advantages and privileges that the aristocracy have. You can make that argument. I think the speech by Dagoucin invites that sort of speculation. It's unclear whether or not the author of this, whether it's Marguerite de Navarre or whomever, it's unclear what that perspective might be. She has Marguerite de Navarre did have some, like, philosophical differences with the ruling class, but there is that sense of instability there, and the idea that it is all a matter of internal, emotional, psychological dynamics, and there's more to life than just the material goods. Significantly, the wife, she puts it all down to context. The sexual act is only better because of the thoughts associated with it. The ring itself that the friend steals is only distinct from any other ring with which it is identical because of the emotional value invested in it. It is all a psychological and emotional interpretation of the world and valuation of the world that has meaning. Everything else is just sort of irrelevant almost. It's subjected to a kind of, well, that's just the way it is. It's an exterior social dynamic that um, maybe it has significance and we need to all sort of maintain it as best we can, like a marriage. But ultimately, the real value, the real significance is not the exterior, but the interior. The social is at its heart psychological and emotional. And that's where this text seems to be pointing, that everything else is just silly. And you're going to make an ass of yourself if you invest too much in it. But if you keep your perspective, if you understand where true value lies, where the key to happiness resides, then everything can work out.